Hudson Taylor in early years, The Growth of the Soul. Chapter 41, A Wealthy Place. August to December 1859. Spared thus in the mercy of God the loss of his own loved one, Hudson Taylor felt the more deeply for Dr. Parker when the angel of death visited his home. With scarcely any warning, on August 26, Mrs. Parker was stricken with dangerous illness and passed away at midnight, leaving 4 little ones motherless. The young missionary at Bridge Street did what they could to come to the help of their friend, and others were ready with practical sympathy, but the shock proved too much for the bereaved husband. One of the children was seriously ill, and amidst the difficulties of his changed position, the doctor began to realize how much his own health was impaired by 5 years spent in China. He had neither heart nor strength for added burdens, and decided before long to take his family home to the care of relatives in Scotland. But what about the medical mission? Outcome for so much prayer and labor. The hospital was full of patients, and the dispensary crowded day by day with a constant stream of people, all of whom needed help. No other doctor was free to take his place, and yet to stop the work seemed out of the question with the winter coming on. How would it be if, in default of better arrangements, to ask his former colleague, Hudson Taylor, to continue the dispensary at any rate? He was quite competent for this, and with the hospital closed, would not have much financial responsibility. The suggestion, it need hardly be said, came at a great surprise to Mr. and Mrs. Taylor, and sent them to their knees in earnest prayer. All they wanted was to know the Lord's will in the matter, and as they waited upon him for guidance, it was clearly given, but in a direction they little anticipated. Yet the dispensary must be kept open, and more than that, the hospital must not be closed. The Lord had given them helpers just suited for such an emergency, a band of native Christians who would rally around them and make the most of the opportunities which the hospital especially afforded. And as to funds or lack of funds, for Dr. Parker had very little to relieve, the work was not theirs but the Lord's. To close it on account of the small balance in hand would practically mean that prayer had lost its power, and if so, they might as well retire from the field. No, for the good of the native Christians, the strengthening of their own faith, and the comfort and blessing of many, they must go forward, and above all, for the glory of God. After waiting upon the Lord for guidance, wrote Hudson Taylor, I felt constrained to undertake not only the dispensary but the hospital as well, relying solely on the faithfulness of a prayer-hearing God to furnish means for its support. At times, there were no fewer than 50 inpatients, besides a large number who daily attended the dispensary. 30 beds were ordinarily allotted to free patients and their attendants, and about as many more to opium smokers who paid for their board while being cured of the habit. As all the wants of the sick in the wards were supplied gratuitously, as well as the medical applicants needed for the outpatient department, the daily expenses were considerable. A number of native attendants also were required, involving their support. The funds for the maintenance of all this had hitherto been supplied by the proceeds of the doctor's foreign practice, and with his departure the source of income ceased. But had not God said that whatever we ask in the name of the Lord Jesus shall be done? And are we not told to seek first the kingdom of God, not means to advance it, and that all these things shall be added to us? Such promises were surely sufficient. Strong, therefore, in the Lord and the inward assurance of his call to this enlarged service, Mr. and Mrs. Taylor prepared to move over to Dr. Parker's. The care of the Bridge Street Christians remained in the hands of their beloved colleague, Mr. Jones, who from the first had been pastor of the little church, and cordial indeed was the prayer and sympathy with which all its members endorsed the action of their missionaries. To Mrs. Taylor, as she thought over it all, it must have seemed very wonderful, the sudden change that brought her husband into a position of usefulness he was so well qualified to fill. They had sought nothing for themselves, but in going after their work had quietly lived down misunderstandings, leaving their reputation in the hands of God. And now he had led them out into a wealthy place, putting them in the charge of a work second to none in Ningpo in its importance, and the common meeting ground of all other missions. Looking across the river to the Presbyterian compound, Mrs. Taylor could not but recall a conversation of the previous summer, to which she alludes to the following letter. Ningpo, September 30th, 1859. My dear mother, Hudson has again been prevented from writing to you, which makes the fourth fortnightly mail since he was able to send off a letter. I hope you will not, I know you will not, begin to think that his dear little daughter is winning his heart away from his beloved parents. If he could steal some hours from the night, he would do so, as he often has before, but his occupations leave him none to steal. He comes upstairs usually between 10 and 11 o'clock, tired out from the long day's work, and after resting a little, down he goes again to see some of his patients or make up medicine for others. You will no doubt be surprised at my speaking of patients in this way, but perhaps still more so when I mention that Dr. Parker is leaving his hospital in dear Hudson's care. A few months ago, I was walking with a friend, Mrs. M. Carty, in one of the gardens of the Presbyterian Mission, when she said, "Do you know what I prophesy? That in a few years Dr. Parker will be taking his family home, and that you and Mr. Taylor will come to live in this large house and carry on the work." I reminded her that Hudson was not a qualified medical man, and said I did not think he should ever live outside of the city. Little could we have imagined that in a few short months Dr. Parker would be on his way home, and with his motherless children, and that we should be in his house, and Hudson taking charge of his work. She herself, far though she was from supposing it, was one of the most important elements in his success at this time. For God works through human means, and but for his wife and Chinese helpers this winter could never have been what it was in Hudson Taylor's experience and in the annuals of the Ningpo Hospital. Thoroughly competent to undertake the direction of their enlarged establishment, Mrs. Taylor relieved him of account-keeping, correspondency, and all household cares, managing the servants and to a certain extent the staff so admirably that his strength was conserved for the medical and spiritual part of the work. She even found time to do a good deal of the wards herself, especially among the women patients, and spent many an hour caring both for body and soul in the dispensary. Her influence among the patients with her husband was great and most beneficial. They saw and felt that there must be something deserving of attention in the religion that led an English lady to labor so particular and naturally repulsive. Over her domestics, too, she exerted an influence only to be won by genuine sympathy and continuous efforts for their good. She looked upon them not so much as persons paid for serving her, but as persons brought under her care, that she might seek to lead them to Christ. She encouraged and helped them to learn to read, and had some of them taught to write, and not a few who, for longer or shorter periods, were connected with her in this way, came to know and love the Master she so faithfully served. She was accustomed to take real comfort from the heartfelt belief in the overruling providence of God in small as well as in great matters. If his word said, "The very hairs of your head are all numbered," she could not doubt it. She was accustomed to seek his counsel in all things, and would not write a note, pay a call, or make a purchase without raising her heart to God. In the same way, he too drew upon divine resources. Outwardly, he was carrying on a great work. Inwardly, he was conscious of a great cry to him, without whom it could not be sustained for a moment. Had he been depending upon man for help, he would have waited until the need could be made known before assuming such heavy responsibilities. But it had come about so suddenly that no one at any distance was aware of the position or could be more prepared than he himself. 8 days before entering upon the care of Ningpo Hospital, wrote Mr. Taylor, I had not the remotest idea of ever doing so. Still least could friends at home have foreseen the need. But the Lord had anticipated it, and already his provision was on the way, as events were happily to prove. The first step taken by the young missionary upon assuming independent charge of the hospital was to call together the assistants and explain the real state of affairs. Dr. Parker, as he told them, had left funds in hand for the expenses of the current month, but little more. After this provision was used up, they must look to the Lord directly for supplies, and it would not be possible to guarantee stated salaries, because whatever happened, he would not go into debt. Under these circumstances, any who wished to do so were at liberty to seek other employment, though he would be glad of their continued service if they were prepared to trust the simple promises of God. This condition of things, as Mr. Taylor had expected, led all who were not decided Christians to withdraw and open the way for other workers. It was a change Mr. Parker had long desired to make, only he had not known how to obtain helpers in a different sort. But Mr. Taylor did, with a greatly lightened heart. He turned to the little circle that, at his critical juncture, did not fail him. For to the Bridge Street Christians it seemed quite as natural to trust the Lord for temporal as for spiritual blessings. Did not the greater include the less? And was he not, as their teacher so often reminded them, a real father who never could forget his children's needs? So to the hospital they came, glad not only to strengthen the hands of their missionary friends, but to prove afresh both to themselves and all concerned the loving kindness of God. Some worked in one way and some in another, some giving freely what time they could spare, and others giving their whole time without promise of wages, though receiving their support. And all took the hospital and its concerns upon their hearts in prayer. No wonder a new atmosphere began to permeate dispensary and wards. Account for it the patients could not, at any rate at first, but they enjoyed nonetheless the happy home-like feeling and the zest with which everything was carried on. The days were full of a new interest. For these attendants, Wang the grass cutter and Wang the painter and NYI and KENG-KUIE and others seemed to possess the secret of perpetual happiness and had so much to impart. Not only were they kind and considerate in the work of the wards, but all their spare time was given to telling of one who had transformed life for them, and who, they said, was ready to receive all who came to him for rest. Then there were books, pictures, and singing. Everything, indeed, seems set to song, and the daily meetings in the chapel only made one long for more. There are a few secrets in China, and the financial basis upon which the hospital was now run was not one of them. Soon the patients knew all about it and were watching eagerly for the outcome. This, too, was something to think and talk about. As the money left by Mr. Parker was used up and Hudson Taylor's own supply ran low, many were the conjectures as to what would happen next. Needless to say, that alone and with little band of helpers, Hudson Taylor was much in prayer at this time. It was perhaps a more open and in that sense crucial test than any that had come to him, and he realized that the faith of not a few was at stake, as well as the continuance of that hospital work. But day after day went by without bringing the expected answer. At length one morning, KUEI-HUA, the cook, footnote. This was the same valued servant who had been with Mr. Taylor in Shanghai, Tisanming, and elsewhere, and who was now a bright Christian, end of footnote, appeared with serious news for his master. The very last bag of rice had been opened and had disappeared rapidly. Then, replied Hudson Taylor, the Lord's time for helping must be close at hand. And so it proved. For before that bag of rice was finished, a letter reached the young missionary that was among the most remarkable ever received. It was from Mr. Berger, and contained a check for £50, like others that had come before. Only in this case, the letter went on to say that a heavy burden had come upon the writer, the burden of wealth to use for God. Mr. Berger's father had recently passed away, leaving him a considerable increase of fortune. The son did not wish to enlarge his personal expenditure. He had had enough before, and was now praying to be guided to the Lord's purpose, in which had taken place Could his friends in China help him? The bill enclosed was for immediate needs. And would they write fully, after praying over the matter, if there were ways in which they could possibly use more? 50 pounds. There it lay on the table, and his far-off friend, knowing nothing about that last bag of rice or the many needs of the hospital, actually asked if he might send them more. No wonder Hudson Taylor was overwhelmed with thankfulness and awe. Suppose he had held back from taking charge of the hospital on account of lack of means, or lack of faith, rather. Lack of faith with such promises and such a God. There was no Salvation Army in those days, but the praise meeting held in the chapel fairly anticipated it in its shouts and songs of joy. But unlike many army meetings, it was to be a short one. For were there not the patients in the wards, and how they listened, these men and women who had known nothing all their lives but blank, empty heathenism. Where is the idol that can do anything like that? Was the question upon many lips and hearts. Have they ever delivered us in our troubles, or answered prayer after this sort?